In this week's video, we're going to start a new three-part series entitled QME Safety. QME Safety. And we're going to talk about all issues related to having a long, productive, and fruitful career as a qualified medical evaluator without running into any trouble, problems, or difficulties with our licensing board as professionals or the Division of Workers' Compensation Medical Unit. And I don't know if you know this or not, but the work that we do is coming under increasing scrutiny lately. At no time ever in our past has our work been as closely scrutinized as it's being scrutinized today. In fact, I recently learned that the Division of Workers' Compensation Medical Unit has an entire new staff devoted to reviewing our work and devoted to issuing QME discipline when that discipline is appropriate. So we're going to talk about how to stay out of trouble with the Division of Workers' Compensation and out of trouble with our professional licensing boards. And we're going to spend some time talking about the most critical issues and the most critical potential red flags and the potential landmines that we face that tempt us as qualified medical evaluators. So for example, in this three-part series we're going to begin today, we're going to talk about the billing complexity factors under CCR 9795. And I'm sure you can imagine that billing issues probably provide the larger component of the opportunities for QMEs to get into trouble, and also provides the largest opportunity for investigation into our work and our work product, which is our QME report. Billing issues certainly constitute the largest source of error and the source of red flags for QME. So we'll take a good hard look in part one of this series into the complexity factors. And then in part two of this series, we'll talk about QME safety in the face-to-face evaluation with your examinee. And again, I don't know if you know this or not, but if you read CCR 40, the disclosure requirements, the so-called disclosure requirements, the examinee has the opportunity to hit the ejector seat at any point during the QME evaluation. They can actually they can eject themselves out of the evaluation and have you stricken as their evaluator if they're able to demonstrate good cause. And many doctors are not aware of the disclosure requirements and are not aware that the examinee has these rights. So I want to talk to you about the face-to-face evaluation. And I want to give you some ideas and suggestions about how to conduct yourself and how to conduct the evaluation so that you and the examinee arrive at the finish line, that you arrive at the promised land. And the promised land is a completed QME evaluation where the examinee is happy with you and has no objection to you as their evaluator. That's how we describe a successful QME encounter, is that you as the medical evaluator get to the finish line without having your examinee pull the ejector seat on you, because you know what? They can. They can. And part of our obligation as qualified medical evaluators is to advise the examinee in advance, either in advance of the appointment or in advance of the actual examination on the date of the appointment. We are obligated and required to advise the examinee that they can terminate the appointment if they are able to demonstrate good cause. If at any time during the evaluation they're not comfortable with you as the evaluator, they can pull the plug. And we're required to advise them of this in advance. Many doctors do not do this, but it's required. So I'm going to talk to you about a sequence of events that you can integrate into your routine protocol to satisfy the requirements of CCR 40 and advise the examinee of their rights, and then also to how to conduct yourself and how to conduct the evaluation so that you both arrive at the finish line, which is at a completed evaluation. So that'll be in part 2 of this 3-part series. And then finally in part 3 of this 3-part series, we'll talk about the much talked about topic of ex parte communication. It seems that doctors are getting into trouble by committing ex parte communication. And so I want to share with you some recent case decisions that give us more insight as to what constitutes ex parte communication and what types of communications are permissible and do not qualify as ex parte communications. So we're going to be touching upon many subjects, all of which have as our general theme over the course of this next 3 weeks, how to have a long, healthy, happy, and lucrative career as a qualified medical evaluator by practicing as an evaluator, by practicing safely, professionally, and in accordance with all of the rules and regulations that govern the work that we do. So I look forward to being with you over the next 3 weeks. To begin today on part 1 of this series, I want to go down to the computer as we get into some of the issues related to the medical legal fee schedule and the complexity factors as governed by California Code of Regulations 9795. So I look forward to being with you in just a few minutes as we begin part 1 of our 3-part series entitled QME Safety. Part 1 of our 3-part series on QME safety. And I want to talk to you today about some prevalent issues that relate to all of us in this industry. And I want to begin today's presentation by simply asking you a question. I want you to think objectively about this question, if you would. If I was to ask you, what are some areas where QME doctors can find themselves into trouble? Or if I was to ask you, what are some of the errors, the omissions, the transgressions, and some of the outright fraudulent activities that qualified medical evaluators engage in, what would you say? Perhaps I can phrase that another way. If I was to ask you to take a look back at your history of doing QME examinations, where are there areas where you've committed errors, you've committed omissions, you've had transgressions, you've done outright fraudulent statements, outright fraudulent billing? Let me ask you, where are those areas? And I just want you to be honest with yourself and work with me and go through this exercise with me. The purpose of this exercise is to benefit us all. And I would be lying to you if I told you that throughout my career I never made an error, or that I never made an omission, or that I never had a transgression, because I have. And the purpose of this 3-part series is for us to all take a hard look at the procedures that we use and the reports that we send out. And the purpose of this 3-part series is for all of us to come together to improve the content of our reports, to improve the quality of our reports, and to improve the truthfulness and the accuracy of our reports, the truthfulness and accuracy of our reports, so that we can enjoy long, happy, fruitful, productive, and lucrative careers as qualified medical evaluators without finding ourselves in any hot water or under any particular license authority's microscope. So we've all made errors, we've all made omissions, and I want us to all come together through this 3-part workshop to commit right now to improve
improve, and to be more truthful and more accurate in our descriptions, in our reports. And for today, for the purposes of today's workshop, I want to talk to you about truthfulness and accuracy in your billing and your use of the QME, the medical legal fee schedule, and the complexity factors that we use in qualifying our reports for either the ML 103 or ML 104 billing levels. Okay, so let's talk about these and several other issues.
Okay, so before we get to the medical legal fee schedule and the complexity factors, I just want to set the tone for our topics today. And I have a couple of interesting photos here up for you to simply refer to. And the photo here on the left shows a bunch of people. They're probably on vacation, and they want to have an adventure outing. So they signed up for what they call the mountain hiking and rappelling adventure. And in the description in the hotel's activity guides, the description was probably very compelling, sounded like a lot of fun. And so these people here, they all signed up for the hiking and rappelling adventure. Well, of course, the main feature of the adventure is to go over the cliff and successfully rappel to the bottom, where they're all probably going to enjoy a nice barbecue and share their experience. But here shows the instructor taking time before the adventure begins to go through the proper use of the equipment, safety measures, emergency procedures, rescue procedures. In other words, they're having here the safety talk before they go over the edge of the cliff. Okay? Well, what about this picture here? You know, this picture shows the motocross rider doing the flying skeleton or the dead man stretch or whatever they call this stunt here. And long before he ever performed this stunt, he's been through this 1,000 times. So that he knows that when he finally attempts this procedure, he won't break his neck and end up dead. And the analogy is that for today's presentation, I want to have the safety talk with you as regards to the complexity factors that we use to define the billing levels of our reports as either ML 103s or ML 104s. And so let me just ask you, what are some of the temptations that we sometimes fall prey to with regards to our billing levels? Well, we're going to go over those in great detail here in just a minute, but I want you to think about yourself, and I want you to think about your own reports as we go through today's discussion. You know, I was recently a guest at a QME relicensure seminar, and the speaker said some very profound words at one point during his presentation, and I'll probably never ever forget those words. And what he said was that sometimes as qualified medical evaluators, you know, we do our examinations in private, meaning that we're in a closed room. Sometimes it's just us and the examinee, or it's us, the examinee, and the interpreter. In other words, it's a very small crowd. And then we go back to our offices and we work on the reports ourselves and in private. And there's no oversight committee. And we sometimes feel that we have a lot of autonomy and we can pretty much call our own shots. Well, the words that this eloquent and profound speaker said was that he said, "We do not do this work, this QME work." He said, "We do not do this work in a vacuum." And he elaborated on that a little bit, and let me elaborate on it here and now. What he said was, we don't do this work in a vacuum, although it seems like sometimes we do. But once you send out your report, you never, ever know where that report's going to end up. And once you leave the QME examination with the examinee, you never ever know who the examinee could consult with, who they could speak with. And same thing goes for the interpreter if the interpreter is present. In other words, I'm sure you'd probably agree with me that you've come across QME reports that have been unearthed from years and even decades past. And it never ceases to amaze me how these documents never die, and you just never know where your QME report is going to end up. And you never know whose desk it may possibly land on. So while it may seem that we do this work in a vacuum when we're in our office alone, maybe even on a Sunday morning with the lights low and a cup of coffee there, and it seems like we have the keys to the kingdom. Well, we don't, because we do not do this work in a vacuum. And so therefore, the operative theme when it comes to preparing our evaluations and preparing our reports are integrity, our honesty, and propriety. And whenever you put down on your report in written word and sign it with your signature, you want to know 10 years from now that you don't regret some of the things that you said and some of the conclusions that you made, and perhaps even some of the billing levels that you quoted. So I want to encourage you to adopt integrity, honesty, and absolute propriety from this point forward in the assembling of your finished product, which is your QME report. I don't know if you've heard at all lately, but workers' compensation insurance fraud investigations are not only ongoing, but they're ramping up. And qualified medical evaluators, of course, as well as treating doctors, of course, as well as imaging facilities, of course, as well as diagnostic study vendors, as well as the examinees themselves, as well as employers, are all subject to investigation for workers' compensation fraud. And the Department of Insurance and local counties are ramping up and are quite proud of their insurance fraud investigation units. And I want you to know that these local counties, they have employees who stay quite busy investigating allegations of workers' compensation fraud. So if you're engaging in fraudulent activity, it will not be very long before that's discovered. So I want to encourage you from this point forward to be absolutely honest and to have absolute propriety in your examinations and in your QME reporting. Now, with that said, let's talk about some of the potential fraud landmines that beckon the QME with regards to the billing levels and the use of the complexity factors to qualify our reports as either the ML103 or ML104 complex levels of reports.
Okay, so let's go to CCR 9795, which is the medical legal fee schedule. And I just want to point out some of the key descriptions and key definitions of the complexity factors for the ML103 and ML104 billing levels that we commonly use for our QME reports. So here's the entirety of CCR 9795. And let's just scroll down to a couple of these key descriptions. First thing I want to point out is that the ML101 billing code is to be used only for follow-up medical legal evaluations that occur within 9 months of the date of your initial evaluation. And some doctors have this code confused with the ML106 billing level, which is to be used for supplemental reports. So that's a distinction between the ML101 and the ML106. The other thing I want to point out about the ML101 billing code is that the ML101 billing code requires us to document some of our activities. And those activities that are required that we document include the review of records, the face-to-face time, and the preparation of the report. And I'm going to create a distinction here between the ML 101 billing level and the ML 104 billing level in a couple of minutes, wherein the ML 104 billing level, under certain circumstances, requires us to document also our time spent in review of records, also our time spent face-to-face with the examinee, and also the time spent in the preparation of the report. But also, the ML 104 billing level allows us additional activities that they simply refer to as the quote-unquote other activities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the ML 104 billing levels. Let's now go to the ML 103 billing level and talk about some of these complexity factors that we have at our disposal when it comes to preparing our reports. So the first thing I want to point out about the ML 103 billing level is that CCR 9795 is quite clear in telling us that if we're going to use either the ML 103 or ML 104 billing levels, then we have to meet certain criteria. And we have to be clear and concise in our description of our use of the complexity factors. And it tells us our instructions at the very beginning of the definition of the ML 103 and ML 104 billing levels. It says in a separate section at the beginning of the report, the physician shall clearly and concisely specify which of the following complexity factors were required for the evaluation. And let me just pause right there. That's not so hard to do, is it? To clearly and concisely specify the complexity factors. But it's the next one that creates a little bit more of a hurdle that we have to be able to successfully surmount in order to be able to invoke each of the complexity factors. And here it says that we must clearly and concisely specify the circumstances which make these complexity factors applicable to the evaluation. And I'll give you one idea as to how you could do that, and I'm sure there are many others as well. But I'll share with you one idea at least in just a moment. Okay, so let's go over the complexity factors that are most commonly applicable to the reports that we produce. So the first complexity factor is 2 or more hours of face-to-face time by the physician with the injured worker. And there are very clear descriptions of what qualifies as face-to-face time. So face-to-face time is simply that time spent face-to-face during the interview and during the physical examination. It does not include time involved with obtaining diagnostic studies, does not involve the time the examinee is waiting in the waiting room. Face-to-face time is actually just that, face-to-face time. Now, if you spend 2 or more hours of face-to-face time with the injured worker, you should be able to document and support any time that you claim that you spent face-to-face with the examinee. So a good question would be, well, how could you do that? How could you document your face-to-face time with the examinee? Well, there's probably many solutions to this question. What I would recommend to you is that you have the examinee sign in on some type of a sign-in sheet and some type of a sign-out sheet. So as an example, many examiners use a checklist of procedures form wherein they can cross-reference their procedures and make sure that they've done everything that they're supposed to do throughout the course of the evaluation. And they have the examinee sign in on this form at the beginning of the evaluation and have them sign out at the conclusion of the evaluation. This allows you to capture the examinee's name or initials, documenting the time that the evaluation started and documenting the time that the evaluation completed. So use some form of a sign-in sheet and a sign-out sheet in case you're ever required to support the face-to-face time as a complexity factor. The next complexity factor involves 2 or more hours of record review by the physician. Now, I've spoken at great length on the procedures involved with a proper review of records. And let me just reiterate some of the salient points here in today's discussion. If you're going to use the complexity factor of 2 or more hours of record review by the physician, you can bet that the parties are going to look at your review of records. And that makes sense, doesn't it? So, in order to comply as a complexity factor, the review of records has to be done properly. Now, many doctors are unaware of this, but the review of records procedure is governed by no fewer than 4 labor codes and or codes of regulation. I think it's 3 labor codes and 1 code of regulation, and I've spoken about this at great length. If you'd like additional detail or additional philosophy on this topic, you can go to YouTube, type in my name, Perry Carpenter, DC, and following the DC, simply type in review of records, and there's several videos that will come up that will take you through this process step by step. But the point is, in order to qualify as a complexity factor, the review of records has to be done properly, and it has to be done in accordance with no fewer than 4 labor codes and or codes of regulation. And so, if you're going to use the complexity factor of review of records, make sure that you comply with the requirements of those labor codes and those codes of regulation. Otherwise, your review of records simply does not qualify because it's not done properly. Okay? Now, let's move on to complexity factor number 6, which is addressing the issue of medical causation upon written request of the party or parties requesting the report. Now, this language here under complexity factor 6 is new. This represents a recent change in the language. It used to say all of the above, but also gave the doctor some latitude to invoke medical causation as a complexity factor with the following phrase. It used to say, or, comma, if a bona fide issue of causation is discovered in the evaluation. So, who would discover the bona fide issue in the evaluation? That would be the doctor. So it used to be that complexity factor 6 allowed the doctor the authority and the latitude to invoke medical causation as a complexity factor if for some reason during the course of the evaluation the doctor was able to uncover either a new or a different issue related to medical causation. Well, that language has now been changed, and that latitude and that authority has been removed from the doctor. And the complexity factor for medical causation now rests within the party or parties requesting the report. It says, upon written request of the party or parties requesting the report. So this is where careful review of your cover letters from the claims administrator, from the applicant attorney, and from the defense attorney becomes important. Now, if in your opinion, if in your review of those cover letters, you determine that the parties are requesting discussion of issues related to medical causation, you should support that when you describe the circumstances. When you describe the circumstances, as it says here, a clear and concise statement, which is right here, when you describe the circumstances which made the complexity factor of causation applicable to the evaluation? Well, how can you do that? How can you do that? Well, there are many ways to do that, but let me suggest the following as a way that you can use to document causation when it qualifies as a complexity factor. So here we are, we're at a different document now. We're at the QME template here. This is a QME template. And let's go over a couple things. We're in the introductory section at the very beginning of the report. And here is where you provide your clear and concise statement. Your clear and concise statement could be something as follows. It says, in compliance with CCR 9795, this report is being submitted as ML 104, or could be ML 103. Comprehensive medical legal evaluation involving the following complexity factors. And here you would document your face-to-face time. Here you would document your review of records time. Here you would document 4 hours or 6 hours. Well, let's talk about medical causation. So here you would document the circumstances that made the discussion of medical causation necessary for your report. So remember that the language has changed, and the doctor has no longer has the authority to discuss medical causation if it's discovered during the evaluation. But for example, some language that you could use to support medical causation as a complexity factor would be to cite the issues as those issues were described to you in the cover letters that you received. So that might go something similar to the following. The May 10th, 2015 cover letter from Sally Jones of Jones Law requests, please discuss and provide your opinion on the medical causation of the injured worker's symptoms of the cervical spine. In your opinion, are the medical findings consistent with the injured worker's claim of a slip and fall injury? And whatever causation issues are requested of you in the cover letters that you receive. Now, let's say you're reviewing the medical records and you come across what appears to be a medical causation issue that is not addressed in the cover letters to you. There's no rule and there's no law that prevents you from simply writing a letter to any of the parties, such as the claims administrator, such as the applicant attorney, such as the defense attorney, and asking them that you've discovered an issue. Do they want you to address such issue? And if they do want you to address such issue, could they please provide that request to you in writing? Okay? So make sure that you properly document the circumstance that required you to invoke the complexity factor of medical causation. Okay? Let's just talk about a couple more of the complexity factors. I want to talk to you about the complexity factor of apportionment, because there's some new information that we have about this as a complexity factor. Many doctors are under the mistaken belief that simply a discussion of apportionment qualifies as a complexity factor, and it does not. It does not. Apportionment only qualifies for a complexity factor when you're able to meet certain very tall criteria. So, for example, one of the criteria is that you discuss the injured worker's permanent impairment due to his employment with 3 or more employers. So, for example, an examinee might have had a lower back injury with employer A, a lower back injury with employer B, and a lower back injury with employer C, and now has permanent impairment, and you have to apportion the permanent impairment amongst 3 or more employers. How often does that happen? That happens very, very rarely. We rarely see injured workers with 3 or more employers. Well, the other criteria is 3 or more injuries to the same body system or same body region. So the injured worker had an injury in January, had an injury in February, and had an injury in March, all to the same part of the body, say the lumbar spine, and now has permanent impairment, and you have to apportion that permanent impairment among those 3 dates of injury. How often does this happen? Not very often. This is quite a tall threshold for this complexity factor. It's my experience and my opinion that the apportionment complexity factor is one of the complexity factors that we just do not have available to us very often because the criteria are quite tall. Okay, the final circumstance that qualifies apportionment as a complexity factor is when you're required to discuss the apportionment of the permanent impairment that involves 2 or more injuries involving 2 or more body systems or body regions. 2 or more injuries involving 2 or more body systems or body regions. Again, this is a very tall criteria and rarely happens. And so it's my opinion, doctors, that you need to take a hard look at apportionment. And if you're using apportionment as a complexity factor and just being vague about how apportionment qualifies as a complexity factor, that is no longer going to fly. And in addition to that, the failure to be able to document or to demonstrate these 3 criteria, many doctors are using apportionment as a complexity factor prior to declaring the examinee to be permanent and stationary. And I have received some new information recently that this is going to be disallowed. In other words, a discussion of apportionment in advance of the examinee being declared to be permanent and stationary is not going to be allowed, at least as a complexity factor. Now, I'm seeking additional and new information on this from the Division of Workers' Compensation because it's my opinion that there are circumstances and there are instances wherein a discussion of apportionment in advance of the permanent and stationary declaration is important and is appropriate. And I myself have done this dozens and dozens of times. In other words, let me give you an example. If you have an examinee that you believe is not yet permanent and stationary, but you know by way of history of the examinee, you know that when he does become permanent and stationary, he is going to have permanent impairment, and you know that the apportionment of the permanent impairment is going to be an issue. So, such as, for example, an employee who has a prior permanent disability award for the lumbar spine, later on has a new subsequent injury to the lumbar spine, you know in that case that apportionment is going to be an issue. Is it appropriate to discuss the apportionment in advance? And in my opinion and in my experience, I have done this. I have discussed apportionment in advance of the permanent and stationary declaration. And in my opinion, and this is just opinion, as I said, I'm seeking additional counsel on this, but in my opinion, it's important to lay out the factors of apportionment in advance for all the parties to be able to see, for all the parties to be able to discuss, and for all the parties to be able to negotiate perhaps a compromise and release settlement in advance of the permanent and stationary date. So, for example, what if you had a situation where you had an examinee, you knew there was going to be permanent impairment, you knew that there was going to be apportionment, but you didn't know that if you're going to be around in a year, in 2 years, when the examinee becomes permanent and stationary, you could lay out those factors of apportionment in advance for the benefit of another evaluator. Or you could lay out those factors of apportionment in advance as a reminder to yourself for when the examinee does become permanent and stationary. So I believe that this issue still remains unresolved, but I simply mention this to you here now as a warning that possibly the apportionment complexity factor could be disallowed for those situations where the examinee is not yet permanent and stationary. So if you routinely or occasionally do discuss apportionment in advance of the permanent and stationary declaration, I just want you to know that this is being scrutinized as we speak. So I urge you to err on the side of caution in using this as a complexity factor. Okay, and then finally, I want to talk to you about complexity factors number 8 and number 9. Number 8 is an evaluation that involves prior multiple injuries to the same body part or parts being evaluated, and requires 3 or more of the complexity factors, including 3 or more hours of record review by the physician. So again, a fairly tall threshold to surmount in order to qualify as a complexity factor, but not all that tall. This is a complexity factor that does receive routine use. So remember that in your report, you need to clearly and concisely explain the circumstances wherein you invoke this as a complexity factor. And in my experience, and one way to do this, probably the most convenient place to do this is in the relevant medical history section of your report. So notice here, I refer the reader to my section below that's entitled the relevant medical history. And in the relevant medical history section, which is down here, you would go ahead and discuss all prior injuries, all prior settlements, any industrial injuries, non-industrial injuries, and all of the circumstances that allow you to invoke complexity factor number 8 in your billing level. Finally, and let's go back to CCR 9795, the final complexity factor that I want to discuss with you is complexity factor, they describe it as number 3 under the ML 104. It says, a comprehensive medical legal evaluation for which the physician and the parties agree prior to the evaluation. So that would be done in writing to the parties. So when all parties can agree that the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances, then you can invoke this complexity factor number 3. When billing for this code under extraordinary circumstances, again, you have to include a clear, concise explanation of the extraordinary circumstance. And then here, you are allowed to document your time with any other activities, and for our purposes, we could put that in quotes, for any other activities related to the preparation of the report, in addition to documenting your time involved with review of the records, the face-to-face time, and the time involved with preparing the report. So that raises the question, what could qualify as other activities? And I'll just leave you to ponder on some of the activities that you engage in the preparation of your QME report that could qualify as other activities. Okay, so doctors, I hope this review of the complexity factors helps you. We go through this together to remind ourselves, and this is a good reminder for me as well, to properly use the complexity factors as they were intended to be used, and to not invoke any of the complexity factors for which your report does not actually qualify, because as I said, our reports are being scrutinized like never before, and the complexity factors is one of the key red flags that draws attention to doctors who may be billing incorrectly. Okay, doctors, so let's bring today's presentation to a close. Let's just summarize and review what we've talked about. This is part one of a three-part series on QME safety and QME safety procedures. Part one, we focused on the proper use of the complexity factors. So I want to encourage you to take a hard look at your use of the complexity factors. And as an idea and as a philosophy as regards to the complexity factors, when you invoke the use of one of the complexity factors into the billing level for your report, whether that be an ML 103 or an ML 104, the section of your report wherein you utilize that complexity factor, such as the review of records, such as the medical causation section, in certain circumstances, the apportionment section of your report, that section of your report should be a masterpiece. It should be absolutely fabulous. It should be flawless. In other words, it's one of the complexity factors. Your report, as relates to the complexity factors, should be very impressive. And that section of your report should clearly substantiate and justify your use of the complexity factor. Makes sense, doesn't it? In other words, there are sections of our report, such as the social history, such as the occupational history. Those aren't complexity factors. But the review of records is, the medical causation is, the relevant medical history is, if it supports your use of the complexity factor for prior multiple injuries. The apportionment section of your report can qualify as a complexity factor. So which sections of your report should be the most thorough, the most detailed, the most accurate, the most meticulous? It's those sections. Makes sense, doesn't it? And this comes, I know, as a new revelation to some doctors, and to other doctors who've been doing this for a substantial period of time. I hope this serves as a good reminder for you to improve your reports with, as regards today's discussion, improve your reports and improve your documentation as relates to the use of the complexity factors. Okay? So stay tuned next week, where we're going to discuss QME safety in the face-to-face evaluation. I have some fabulous and brand new ideas for you there that will allow you and your examinee to establish instant rapport the moment you meet, and that will create a caring, kind, comfortable atmosphere for the examinee, and allow both you and the examinee to get to a completed evaluation, both of you happy with each other, and both of you willing to move forward together, and specifically with the examinee willing to move forward with you as their evaluator over the life of the claim, which we know can be as many as months and even years into the future. So we want examinees to be happy with us, and I have several brand new and brilliant ideas for you on how to accomplish just that. And then in part three, we're going to go over some new findings and new discussions on ex-parte communication. So this is a series of programs that are must-watches and must-listens. You know, in our last series, we did an entire 4-week series on QME report writing mastery. And over the course of that 4-part series, many doctors throughout the entire state of California took a hard look at their reports, at their work product. And those doctors that were open-minded and willing to make changes to their reports have improved their reports as a result. So if 100 doctors improve the content and quality of their reports, imagine how that starts to change the entire industry. The entire industry starts experiencing a better product from us out here in the field as qualified medical evaluators. Well, that's the same philosophy that I want to apply to this month's series on QME safety. I want all of us as qualified medical evaluators to take a hard look at our procedures and to seek to improve our reputation as competent, truthful, and accurate, and qualified medical evaluators. So I look forward to being with you over the next 3 to 4 weeks as we continue this series on QME safety. It's been my pleasure to be with you here today, and for now, I want you to know that I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.